There are places that history simply forgot to name. Not because they were unimportant, but because someone very deliberately made sure they would never be found. Somewhere in the flat, unforgiving lowlands of eastern Tennessee, between a creek that no longer appears on any map and a ridge that locals stopped climbing sometime around 1871, there stood a cabin, one room, no glass in the window frames at all, no deed of land, no census record, no church register with its name, nothing that would allow you 150 years later to point to a map and say, there, that is where it happened. And yet children lived there more than one generation. Children who were seen by exactly two categories of people, those who worked the surrounding land and kept their mouth shut, and those who stumbled too close by accident and were quietly persuaded to forget what they had seen. The question is not whether the cabin existed. It did. The question, the one that consumed the life of at least one man who tried to answer it, is what exactly those children were being kept from. Before we continue with the story of the children of Harrow Creek, if you're new here, subscribe and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing who's out there in the dark with us. The enumerator, the federal census of 1870, was by any standard a bureaucratic nightmare. It was the first census taken after the war, the first one that attempted, in theory at least, to count every person living on American soil, regardless of race, regardless of whether the person in question wanted very badly to remain uncounted. The Reconstruction-era South was still smoldering in ways that had nothing to do with fire. Whole counties had been reorganized. Old plantation records had been burned, some deliberately, some by the chaos of the preceding decade. Names had changed. Land had changed hands through violence, through law, through both at once. The job of the census enumerator in the summer of 1870 was not merely statistical. It was in certain places an act requiring something approaching courage. Alias Puit was 31 years old when he was appointed as an enumerator for a section of Overton County, Tennessee. He was not a remarkable man in any visible way. He stood medium height, had brown hair that had begun to thin at the temples, wore the same black coat in summer and winter, and had a reputation among the farmers of the county for being thorough to the point of obstinacy. He recorded names no one wanted recorded. He asked follow-up questions when the answers he received seemed designed to close a subject rather than address it. He had a small, leather notebook, not his official government ledger, but a private one in which he wrote observations that the official forms had no column for. It was in that private notebook that he first wrote on a Tuesday in late August of 1870. The following sentence, 3 children seen near the Harrow Creek crossing, none of which were claimed by any household I have since visited. Inquired at Girvan Farm, man said only that they belonged to the Hills, would not elaborate. Woman of the house did not look up from her work. He wrote it almost as an afterthought. He had been walking the creek road for most of the day, checking off properties against a rough map he'd been given by the county clerk. He had passed through an area of broken fence and thin wooded hillside when he saw them. 2 girls and a boy. The girls might have been 8 and 10 roughly. The boy perhaps 6. They were playing at the edge of the creek or doing something that resembled playing from a distance. When Puit had drawn closer, he noticed that they stopped, all 3 of them completely still, and watched him with an attention that struck him as wrong for children their age. Not frightened, not curious, measuring, he had called out a greeting. None of them answered. He had asked where they lived, pointing up the ridge behind them in the general direction from which they seemed to have come. The older girl, the 10-year Meter Meenick, old he estimated, turned her head very slowly in that direction, as if she was checking something, then turned back without a word. When he reached the road again and continued north, he looked back twice. The second time they were gone. He asked at the Girvan Farm as the notebook records. He asked at 2 other properties further along the road. At each one he received variations on the same response. A deflection, a change of subject, a sudden intense interest in something happening just over his shoulder. One man, a tenant farmer named Waddell, who kept a tobacco patch on the eastern slope, said with what Puit described as studied casualness, that it was nothing to put in a government book, that children ran wild all through those hills, that it was no different from any other county in the state, that Puit was making more of it than was there. Puit wrote that down too. He finished his route and submitted his official ledger to the county clerk in Livingston the following week. The 3 children near Harrow Creek were not in it. He had no names. He had no household to assign them to. The official record as it stands today in the National Archives contains no mention of them, but Puit kept his private notebook. And in September of 1870, he went back. He told no one he was going. He had no official reason to return. His enumeration was complete, his reports filed, his payment, and he received. What he had was the particular unease that settles on a thorough man when he knows that something has been left out of an account that was supposed to be complete. He rode out on a Saturday morning, following the creek road past the Jervin property, past the Weddell tobacco patch, past the point where the road became little more than a rooted track. He had asked around quietly in the week since his first visit, and had learned one additional fact, that there was a structure of some kind further up from the creek on a patch of land that had once belonged to a man named Anil Dow, who had died in 1862 without heirs anyone would name. What had happened to the land after Dow's death was not clearly recorded. The county records were incomplete for the war years, which surprised no one. The land had no current registered owner, or if it did, that ownership was registered somewhere Puig had not yet found. The track wound up from the creek through a stand of tulip poplar that had grown thick and untended since the war. The canopy was high enough that the light changed, greened, dimmed, grew heavier with moisture. Puig's horse became reluctant. He tied it to a branch well before the train thinned and continued on foot. He found the cabin approximately 300 yards from where he'd left the horse. It was set back into the hillside in a way that made it nearly invisible from below. The structure was not large, perhaps 16 feet by 20, built of hun logs that had darkened to near black with age and damp. The roof was split-shingled, low-pitched. There was a door solid, closed, and there were, as he confirmed, walking the entire perimeter. No windows not boarded up, not covered, simply absent. The walls were unbroken logs on every side. The only opening to the outside world was the door at the front and a narrow gap at the roofline on the south wall, where the chinking had failed and not been repaired. Puig stood outside and listened. From within, voices low, indistinct, more than one. He knocked. The voices stopped immediately, a silence so total that he became aware of the creek somewhere below and the wind in the tulip poplars and nothing else. He knocked again and called out that he was a county enumerator, that he meant no harm, that he was simply there to complete an official record. The door opened. The woman who stood in it was perhaps 45 years old, though her face carried the kind of settled stillness that makes exact age difficult to determine. She was thin, plainly dressed in homespun, and she looked at him with an expression that in his notebook struggled to name. He tried resignation and then crossed it out, and tried patience and crossed that out too, finally settling on a phrase that is more revealing than any single word. As though she had been expecting this and had decided long ago how she would handle it. She told him her name was Nora, just Nora. When he asked for a family name, she said she had none worth recording. He asked how many people lived in the cabin. She said enough. He asked about the children he had seen at the creek. A pause, a small pause, the length of a breath held and released. Then they wander. He asked whose children they were. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped slightly to the side, not to invite him in, but enough that he could see the interior of the cabin for a moment before she corrected the angle of the door. He saw 3 children seated on a low bench against the far wall. A fourth stood by what appeared to be a small cook stove. The light inside was dim from the open door, and he noted from a single tallow candle on a shelf, but sufficient to see that all 4 were very still, looking directly at him with the same quality of attention he had noticed at the creek. Then she said quite quietly, "I'd not write us down if I were you." It was not a threat. He was clear on that point in his notebook, underlined it in fact. Not a threat. A piece of advice sincerely given as one might warn a traveler about a road that floods in rain. He pressed her further. He asked her name again, asked about the land, asked whether she had documentation for her residence there. Each question unmet with the same still unhurried non-answer, not hostility. Something closer to the calm of a person who has simply decided that certain questions do not require response. Eventually, he left. He wrote 3 pages about the visit that night. Then, for reasons he did not record, he waited 4 years before going back a third time. The history of a piece of ground to understand what Elias Puig found when he returned in 1874. It helps to understand what the land around Harrow Creek had been before the war, and more importantly, what it had been used for. Overton County in the antebellum period was not plantation country. This is important. The Great Plantation System, the one that fills most Americans' mental image of the pre-war South, required the flat, rich bottomlands of the Mississippi Delta, the coastal lowlands of the Corrales, the black soil cotton country of Alabama and Georgia. Overton County was none of those things. It was hill country, broken ground, thin soil, terrain more suited to corn and livestock, and subsistence farming than to the vast monoculture operations that depended on large enslaved labor forces. This does not mean that enslaved people were absent from Overton County. They were not. But their situation was different in character, often held in small numbers, sometimes only 1 or 2 per household, sometimes in arrangements that bore no resemblance to The enormous operations further south, arrangements that were in their own way more intimate, and intimacy in the context of bondage is not a comfort. It is an additional complication. Enel Dow, the man who had originally owned the land on which the windowless cabin stood, had held 3 enslaved people according to the 1850 slave schedule. The schedule, as was then the law, listed them only by age, sex, and a rough physical description. No names, no relationships to one another noted. By the 1860 schedule, only 2 remained. What happened to the third was not recorded. Dow himself died in April of 1862, a few months after Tennessee began its complicated, convulsive slide toward Confederate governance and the chaos that followed. He left no will that was ever probated. He had no wife. He had a brother in Kentucky who, by all available records, never came south to claim the land. What happened to the 2 remaining enslaved people on Dow's land in the spring of 1862 is a question that the official record cannot answer. They simply stop appearing. The farm, the main farm, the one closer to the road, was eventually absorbed by a neighboring property sometime in the late 1860s. The land at the top of the ridge around the hillside clearing was apparently not considered worth the trouble of claiming, and so it sat officially no one's. Officially empty. Puett, in the years between his second and third visit, had done what a thorough man does. He had looked for the history in whatever records survived. He found the slave schedules. He found the note about Dow's death. He found the absence of any probated will, any transfer of land, any subsequent record of ownership, and he found in a county ledger that recorded delinquent taxes that the hillside parcel had been listed as unclaimed 3 times between 1865 and 1870, with no action taken to collect or transfer it. Someone in the county office had apparently decided each time the question came up to simply leave it alone. This did not strike him as administrative incompetence. He was too thorough for that interpretation. It struck him as a decision. What grew in the silence? There is a kind of community that forms in the spaces that official life leaves unattended. It is not unique to any era or region, but it was particularly visible in the post-war South, where the collapse of one legal order and the incomplete establishment of another left vast zones of ambiguity, geographic, legal, social, in which people survived by simply continuing to exist in ways that the new order had not yet found language to address. The hillside at Harrow Creek had become one of those spaces. What Puett pieced together from his visits, from conversations with people who spoke more freely once they understood, he was not reporting to Ennio. Nessie, with the power to change their circumstances, from a letter he received in 1876 from a Methodist circuit rider who had passed through the area in 1867, was a picture that did not fit neatly into any category he had encountered in his work as an enumerator. The woman named Nora had been one of Enel Dow's 2 enslaved people. The other had been a man older who had died during the war. What Nora had done after Dow's death, after the war, after emancipation, was to remain exactly where she was, not because she had nowhere to go, but because the cabin Entikes, the windowless cabin on the hillside, which had apparently been built during Dow's lifetime as a structure separate from the main farm, and whose original purpose Puett was never able to definitively establish, was in some sense he found difficult to articulate in his notebook. Hers, she had been there alone for most of 1862 and 1863, then gradually she had not been alone. The Methodist circuit rider, a man named August Hale, whose letter to Puett is the most vivid document we have about the early years of the Harrow Creek settlement, described stopping at the cabin in the autumn of 1867 on a pastoral circuit through the county. He had been directed there by a freedman's family living 3 miles south, who told him with some hesitation that there were children at the cabin who might benefit from spiritual instruction. What Hale found when he arrived was not what he had expected. He expected, he wrote in his letter, perhaps a woman with her own children, living in poverty, but in the ordinary condition of a freed person trying to establish a household. What he found were 7 children of varying ages, none of whom appeared to be related to one another by blood, living with Nora in a cabin that had, as he put it, no window to any outside view, which I noted immediately and found peculiar, the room being lit only by candle and fire, even at noon. He asked Nora about the children. She told him in the careful, measured way that Puett would later also encounter that they were children who needed a place. He asked where they had come from. She said, from different places. He asked whether any of them had families to return to. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "They do not." Hale spent 2 days at the cabin. He taught the children from a Bible he carried. He noted that they were almost without exception acutely attentive. That quality again, that watchful measuring attention, and that several of them appeared to have learned to read, not perfectly but functionally, from Nora herself. He noted that none of them volunteered information about their origins. He noted that Nora, when pressed, simply repeated that they were children who needed a place, as though this explanation was so complete that aberration was unnecessary. He left on the third morning with a sensation he described as not unease exactly, but something near to it, a sense that what I had been shown was only the front of a thing, and that the back of it was not for my eyes. What Puig found in 1874, he went back in late October. The trees were turning, the creek road was muddy from an early cold rain, and his horse, a different animal than the one he had ridden in 1870, which had died 2 years prior, was steadier on the approach through the poplars. The cabin looked identical to how he had left it. The same darkened logs, the same missing windows, the same low-pitched roof, though he noticed that the chinking gap at the roofline had been repaired since his last visit. The forest around it had grown closer, or seemed to have, which is the effect the forest gives when it is left alone long enough. He knocked. This time the door opened more quickly. Nora was older, 4 years older, which on a face that had already been settled and still seemed to register differently than it would on a more animated face. A deepening of certain lines, a slight change in the set of the eyes. She looked at him without surprise. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he answered, though his notebook does not record that he actually made such a promise in 1870. She let him in. The interior of the cabin was as he had partially glimpsed it 4 years earlier. One room, low ceiling, a packed dirt floor covered in several places with woven grass mats, the cook stove, a long table of rough-hewn wood, shelves along one wall holding an assortment of containers, bundles, and he was struck to notice a significant number of books, not elegant volumes, but battered practical things, a few with no covers remaining, held together with cord. In a corner, a spinning wheel. In another corner, what appeared to be a pile of folded cloth neatly stacked. There were no children present, he asked after them. Nora said they were in the woods, which, she said in a way that indicated this was normal, that they spent a great deal of time in the woods. He sat at the table when she gestured to it and accepted a cup of something that turned out to be a tea brewed from dried chori. He opened his private notebook, not his official one, and placed it on the table where she could see it, a gesture he seemed to intend as a signal that what he was doing was not official. He asked her this time to tell him everything. She looked at the notebook for a moment. Then she looked at him. Then she said with that particular quality of stillness he always associated with her, "That is a very large thing you're asking." "I have time," he said. There was a pause long enough that he had begun to think she would not answer. Then she said, "Close the door." He had not noticed that he had left it open. He closed it. What she told him, she did not tell him everything. He was clear on this point. But she told him enough. The children were not hers by blood. She had no children of her own. She said this without apparent emotion in the way people sometimes state facts that have long since been incorporated into the architecture of a life rather than remaining exposed as wounds. They came from different places over different years. She could not give him exact dates for most of them. The first had come in 1863, a boy of about 4 brought by a woman who had said only that she was dying and that the boy had no one else. Nora had said yes. She did not say why she said yes to a thing that complicated her survival enormously. She seemed to consider the question unworthy of an answer, or perhaps unanswerable, in the terms Puig was offering. Others had followed, not a steady stream. Sometimes a year or more would pass with no one new, then occasionally 2 within a few months. The circumstances varied. Some were brought by adults who could not or would not stay. Freed people moving north, people in circumstances too dangerous for a child to accompany them. Some in the earlier years were children who had been separated from families during the final chaos of the war, in ways that may have been deliberate on the part of someone, or may have been the ordinary catastrophic randomness of that period. She did not make distinctions between these categories, or if she did not share those distinctions with Puig. She kept no records. She had kept no records deliberately. She said she used no surnames for herself or the children. She had names for them, given names, some of which she had chosen herself, some of which they had come with, but no surnames because surnames, she said, were what the county office used to find people. She had built the reading practice herself, teaching the older children from whatever books she could acquire, then having those children teach the younger ones, so that the knowledge spread through the cabin's population without her having to carry it entirely alone. The books on the shelves were the accumulation of 15 years of this practice, acquired through trades through the Methodist circuit rider, through occasional contact with a family 3 miles south, who had more resources and discretion. Puig asked her how she sustained the household materially: food, clothing, fuel. She described a system of extraordinary self-sufficiency supplemented by a few carefully maintained relationships with people in the surrounding area who provided certain goods in exchange for labor, cloth, and food produced at the cabin, and who understood implicitly that these transactions were not to be discussed, a kind of informal economy invisible to the official record that had sustained a small household of rotating occupants for over a decade. He asked about the window frames. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Windows are for seeing in, not just for seeing out." He wrote this down. He did not pursue the question further, and she did not elaborate. The children who came back here is what Puig understood by the end of his second long visit after 3 hours at the table and a meal of cornbread and dried beans taken in the late afternoon. The cabin was not simply a refuge. It was something closer to a school. And Nora was not simply a caretaker. She was something closer to a teacher or a keeper, depending on how you read the word. The children who lived at the cabin were not permanent residents. Some of them at some point left. Where they went and under what circumstances was the question Puig found himself least able to answer. Nora was willing to say that children left the cabin when they were old enough. Old enough being a term she declined to define more specifically than when they were ready. She would say that they left for the towns, for other counties, for places north of Tennessee. She would not give names of places or names of people. She would not say whether she maintained any contact with those who had left, though noted a quality to her reticence on this particular point that suggested she did. He asked whether any of them had been claimed by families, whether any of the original families from whom the children had been separated during the war had ever come to the cabin looking for them. This question produced the longest silence of the entire conversation. When she answered, she said only, "Some things are not findable once they are lost." Puig sat with this for a moment. Then he asked a more direct question, whether any person, official or otherwise, had ever come to the cabin with a claim on any of the children. She looked at him with that quality of patience he had been trying to name since his first visit. She said people have come. He waited, and they did not find what they were looking for. She said he asked what they were looking for. She said the same things people have always come looking for. He understood from the weight of the silence after this that she was not going to elaborate. And he understood, or believed he understood, that the answer was not a single thing, but a category. A category that included not just one kind of claim, but many kinds. Labor claims, property claims, claims of a type that the law of 1870 officially no longer recognized, but that had not in the experience of a great many people in Overton County and elsewhere entirely ceased to be attempted in practice. The windowless cabin set back into the hills, invisible from below, on land that officially belonged to no one. It was not accidental. None of it was accidental. Samuel Hebb, in the spring of 1875, Elias Puig, made what turned out to be a significant error. He told someone. He did not mean it as an error, he meant it as a conversation. The kind of conversation that occurs between two men who trust each other and who share a professional investment in the accuracy and completeness of the public record. The person he told was Samuel Hebb, who was then serving as assistant county clerk for Overton County, a position he had held since 1868. Hebb was a compact, precise man with reddish whiskers and a habit of repeating things back to you as a way of confirming he had heard them correctly. He had known Puig since the census work in 1870 and trusted his observations. When Puig described the cabin, the children, the woman named Nora, and the years of quiet, invisible existence in the hills above Harrow Creek, Hebb listened with total attention, repeating phrases back at intervals. No window frames at all. No records of the land transfer, 7 children at the time of the 1867 visit, soul, and made notes on the margin of a letter he had been in the process of drafting when came in. Puig, in retrospect, should have noticed what kind of notes Hebb was making. They were not sympathetic notes, they were administrative notes. Hebb was not a cruel man. This is important. He was a man who believed genuinely in the way certain men of his era believed that the proper operation of civil society required every person and every property to exist within the legible structures of that society. The cabin above Harrow Creek was, in his view, a piece of land that had been improperly left in legal ambiguity for over a decade. The children living there were, by the same logic, persons without legal status, without documentation, without the official existence that he considered both a right and an obligation. His interest in rectifying this was, he would have said, entirely on their behalf. What he did not understand or did not consider was that the legal structure he intended to bring to bear on the situation was not, from Nora's perspective, a form of protection. It was the thing she had been hiding from. The letter to the Freedmen's Bureau. In June of 1875, Hebb wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau office in Nashville. By 1875, the Bureau was in the final months of its formal operation. It would be officially disbanded the following year, its work declared complete by a federal government that had begun the long retreat from Reconstruction. But it still had a functioning correspondence office, and Hebb's letter was answered. The response came in August, a brief business-like letter from a bureau agent named Cartwright, who indica. Ted that the situation Heb described was not entirely unusual, that there were known communities of formerly enslaved people living on unclaimed land throughout the Hill counties, and that the Bureau would, if could provide more specific geographic information, attempt to assess the situation and ensure that the individuals in question are availing themselves of the protections and resources available to freed people under current law. Heb provided the geographic information. Poot did not learn about any of this until October of 1875, when Heb mentioned the letter in passing during a conversation about an unrelated matter. Poot's notebook, which he maintained throughout this period, records his reaction as a physical one. He wrote, "Felt the blood leave my face, the kind that leaves you feeling not cold but hollow." He went immediately to the cabin. The warning. He arrived 3 days ahead of the bureau agent, as it turned out, though he did not know this at the time. He arrived not knowing whether he was too late for anything or too early for something, only knowing that he had told the wrong person in the wrong way, and that the consequences were moving toward Harrow Creek faster than he could calculate. Nora opened the door before he knocked. She was standing in the doorway when he came up the path through the poplars as though she had heard him coming from some distance. She said, I know why you're here." He started to explain. She cut him off, not rudely, but cleanly. "I know." He asked how. She said the land has ears when people stop listening to it. He could not tell then or later whether this was a metaphor or whether she meant it literally, whether someone in the area had heard of Heb's letter and sent word up the hill through those quiet channels of communication that the official world could never quite locate or account for. She told him standing in the doorway that she had been preparing for this possibility for years. Not this specific possibility, not a bureau agent arriving with papers, but the general possibility of official attention of some kind. She told him there were aspects of the arrangement at the cabin that she would change immediately. She told him that some of the children were at that moment not at the cabin. He asked what he should do. She said nothing. "You have done enough." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of assessment delivered with the same steady quality as everything else she had ever said to him. He had done enough, meaning both that his interference had reached its limits and that regardless of what followed, the thing he had set in motion could not be unset. He left the cabin that afternoon, having a strong sense that he would not see it again. Not because anything would be destroyed, but because Nora, with that quality of far-sighted calm, would make certain that what needed to be invisible would become invisible, and that he, Elias Puit, being now associated with whatever official investigation followed, was no longer someone to whom the cabin's true face could be shown. He was right. He never went back. The arrival of Cartwright, the Freed Men's Bureau agent who came to Overton County in October of 1875, was named Fletcher Cartwright, and he was not what people who heard federal agent imagined. He was 26 years old. He had been assigned to the Bureau's Tennessee operations after a year working as a schoolteacher in Memphis, which was itself an assignment he had come to from Ohio, where he had grown up in a Quaker household with a father who had spent 30 years helping people travel north on routes that were not on any map. He was by background and temperament someone who knew how to see what official structures were designed to obscure. He was also by this point in 1875. Tired in a way that only people who have been trying to hold back a retreating tide for several years can become tired. He arrived in Livingston, the county seat, on a Monday. He spoke with Heb, who gave him what geographic information he had along with Puit's name as a source of additional detail. Cartwright went to see Puit the next morning. The conversation between them is not fully documented, but Puit's notebook contains a partial account. What comes through clearly is that Cartwright was not approaching the situation as a bureaucratic investigation. He was approaching it as something closer to a pastoral visit, a term he apparently used himself, which Puit found both accurate and slightly evasive. He wanted to know, Cartwright said, not whether the people at the cabin were in compliance with any particular legal requirement, but whether they were safe, whether they were in need of anything, whether they were in a situation that required outside intervention, or a situation that had, in fact, been managing itself better without it. Puit, who had spent several weeks in a state of anguish about the consequences of his disclosure, found this formulation something close to a relief. He told Cartwright everything he knew. Cartwright went up the creek road on a Wednesday morning in late October alone on foot. He had asked Puit to come, but Puit had declined, not out of cowardice. He wrote in his notebook, but out of what he called a sense that he had already imposed himself enough on whatever was happening at that cabin, and that another appearance by him in the company of an official would convey the wrong message about whose side he was on. Cartwright found the path through the poplars without much difficulty. He found the cabin in the hillside clearing, dark logged, roof low, in Dallas. He knocked. He waited longer than most people would have waited before knocking again. He knocked again. Nothing. He walked the perimeter. He confirmed, as Puat had described, that there were no window openings in any of the walls. He noted at the south wall what appeared to be a recent repair to the chinking near the roofline, newer mortar filling a gap that had clearly been opened recently. He tried the door. It was not locked in the sense of having a lock, but it was latched from the inside. He stood in front of the cabin for perhaps half an hour by his own account. He called out twice, clearly identifying himself and his purpose, that he was from the Ferryman's Bureau, that he had no papers, that he was not there to compel anyone to do anything, that he simply wanted to talk. Silence. He left a note on the door, wedged in the crack of the frame. He wrote in his account later that he had no confidence the note would accomplish anything, but that it seemed important to make some record that he had tried. He went back to Livingston. He wrote his report to the Nashville office. The report, which survives in the Bureau's records at the National Archives, stated that he had found no individuals present at the described location, that the structure was extant and appeared to have been recently occupied, but was empty at the time of his visit, and that he had been unable to conduct any interviews. He recommended that the matter be closed pending any future developments. The Bureau was disbanded the following March. The matter officially was closed. Cartwright had written the note in pencil on a small square of paper folded twice. What he wrote, and he included this in a private letter to a colleague in Nashville, not in his official report, was the following. I know why you don't have windows. I know what you have been doing here and why. I am not your enemy, and I am not interested in anything that would endanger what you have built. I am only here to ask if you need anything. If you do not, then this note is the last you will hear from me. If you do, I can be reached at the following address. He included his address in Cincinnati, where he intended to go after the Bureau's closure. He never received a response, but in the spring of 1877, he received at his Cincinnati address a package containing a small book handmade, the pages stitched together with cord, the cover, a piece of pressed bark. It contained in careful handwriting what appeared to be a series of lessons, arithmetic, reading, penmanship. No name, no address, no inscription except on the inside front cover the words, "Thank you for walking away." He kept the book for the rest of his life. What the records cannot say, there is a peculiar frustration that comes with researching lives that were deliberately lived outside the record. You find the edges, the census that doesn't include them, the deed that never existed, the Bureau report that found an empty cabin, and from those edges you try to reconstruct the shape of the thing in the center. But the center remains by design, inaccessible. The person who built it that way was not careless. They were careful in the most precise and intentional sense of the word. Nora's last name, if she had one after emancipation, which was not required but was common, appears in no record that survives. Her birth year is unrecorded. Her death, if it occurred in Overton County or anywhere near it, was not registered, which was not unusual for the period and population. She is present in the historical record only through the observations of 3 men who visited the cabin and found it worth writing about: Poot, Hale the circuit rider, and Cartwright. Through those 3 accounts, certain things can be said with some confidence. She was literate and had been for some time before the war, which given her legal status prior to emancipation is itself a significant fact requiring explanation. Where she learned to read and from whom is unknown. Hale noted that her command of written language was precise and considered, an observation that appears in his 1876 letter to Puat in the context of a book. She showed him that she had apparently been writing a record of the children, not by name or history, but by what they knew when they arrived and what they knew when they left. A kind of catalog of learning. He described it as the most unusual document I have encountered in 20 years of pastoral work. The book has not been found. The children, the ones who cycled through the cabin over the years of its operation, are equally invisible in the record. Puat, in a letter he wrote to Cartwright in 1878, estimated that between 1863 and 1875, the year of Cartwright's visit, the cabin had housed somewhere between 20 and 30 children, based on what Nora had told him and what he could piece together from secondary sources. 20 to 30 children who grew up, who left, who presumably built lives somewhere in towns and other counties in the north, but who carry no documentary trail back to the hillside above Harrow Creek. This is, wrote in the same letter, both the achievement and the tragedy of what Nora had built. She had created something that worked, a system of survival and education and careful and visible protection that had sustained lives which official society had no particular interest in sustaining, and she had done it in a way that made it by design unverifiable. The evidence of its success was its absence from the record. Every child who passed through and arrived safely somewhere else and built a life there was a child who, from the perspective of the historical archive, simply had not existed. The people around Harrow Creek who had known about the cabin and said nothing. The Jervin family, the tenant farmer Waddell, the Freridman's family 3 miles south who had sent Hale the circuit rider. They were not innocent of the situation. They were complicit in it in the precise sense of the word. They had made a collective unspoken decision to allow something to exist that the law of their county at various points in its operation might have classified differently. The reasons for this varied. Hale, in his 1867 visit, had spoken with the Freridman's family, a husband and wife he identified in his letter only as Robert and Clara Herrera with 2 grown sons, and they had spoken with more candor than anyone else in the record. Clara Herrera had told him that the cabin had been there doing what it was doing since before the war ended, and that they had been sending people to it. People who needed to be somewhere that no one could find them since approximately 1864. That they considered what Nora was doing to be a form of protection, that the community could not provide openly but could support quietly, that this was understood among a network of freed people in the area as a resource, though never discussed in terms that could be overheard. Robert added something that Hale found difficult to incorporate into his generally optimistic theological frame, that they had on at least 2 occasions before the end of the war helped Nora deal with people who had come up the hill with intentions that were not pastoral. He did not describe what deal with meant. Hale did not press him. Pwitt, when he read this letter years later, understood its implications better than Hale had. The cabin was not merely hidden. It was, in the years of its most precarious operation, actively defended by a network of people who understood the stakes in a way that a Methodist circuit rider from Ohio could not quite follow. The lack of windows was not just about preventing those outside from seeing in. It was about not giving light to anyone who might be approaching in the dark, watching for signs of habitation. What Pwitt spent his final years trying to answer. Elias Pwitt died in 1893, at the age of 54, from a lung condition that had troubled him since the mid-1880s. He never married. He spent his last years working as a land records clerk in Livingston, a job that gave him access to exactly the kind of documentation he had spent over 2 decades trying to use to reconstruct the story of the cabin at Harrow Creek. He found over those years several things. He found a letter in a bundle of misfiled correspondence at the county office, dated 1869, from a man named Donaldson Harp who had been a landowner in the county during the war. The letter was addressed to a colleague in another county and was about an unrelated matter, but contained a passage that read, "The Dowd place continues to give trouble. If by trouble you mean that certain persons of the old arrangement have not removed themselves as expected, and further that they appear to have extended their hospitality in ways that were not contracted for, I have made inquiries and been advised that the matter is better, let alone which I do not find satisfactory, but which I have for the time being followed." He found in the same misfiled bundle a partial list of freed people who had registered with the County Welfare Committee in 1866. The list was incomplete. It had clearly been folded and refolded many times, suggesting it had been in a pocket, but one entry near the bottom read Nora Dowd, location hills east of H Creek, status residing, no assistance record. He had underlined no assistance rect in pencil. Next to it he had written in the margin, she would not have registered at all if she were not required to. The phrase is hers, not the committee's. He found no death record for Nora, no sale or transfer of the hillside property until 1882, when it was absorbed into an adjacent parcel through a tax delinquency process. The 1882 record included a surveyor's note that the property contained one structure in partial disrepair, uninhabited at time of survey. Partial disrepair, uninhabited, he found in a collection of letters donated to the County Historical Society in 1891. A letter from a woman in Cincinnati, a teacher evidently writing to a colleague in Tennessee about her own work establishing a reading school for black children in her neighborhood. The letter was warm, practical, and contained one passage that Pwitt had underlined heavily. "The truth is, I learned what I know about teaching from a woman I cannot name in a place I cannot specify. But I will say that she taught me one thing that I have carried into every schoolroom I have ever entered, that a person who can read cannot be owned in the same way as a person who cannot." She did not say this grandly. She said it the way you explain where to find the road as a piece of information that seemed obvious to her, and that she was simply passing along. I have been passing it along ever since. He did not know if this woman was one of Nora's children. He had no way to know. He wrote in the last entry of the last private notebook he kept a sentence that was not continued, that ended at the bottom of a page with no following page. If it was her, then something of what happened on that hill found its way into the world in exactly the way Nora intended. And if it was not, then someone else built the same thing somewhere else, which is perhaps the more important point, that it could be built and was built without anyone asking permission and without leaving a record that any authority could close. What survives? By the turn of the century, the physical evidence of the cabin's existence was nearly gone. The 1882 surveyor had described it as impartial disrepair. A note in the records of the new landowner, a man named Vernon Coates, who had acquired the hillside parcel along with the adjacent farmland as part of a larger consolidation, indicates that in 1885 he had sent workers to clear the ridge of old timber and clear whatever structures were on it. The workers returned and told him there was nothing up there worth clearing. Some old log walls, a collapsed roof, ground cover taking over everything. He recorded this in his farm ledger and moved on. The tulip poplars and the hickory and the pawpaw that grew in the cleared area around where the cabin had stood would have done their slow, thorough work through the 1880s and 1890s. By the time the first decade of the new century had passed, there would have been no visible indication to anyone walking that ground that a structure had ever stood there. The hillside would have looked as it looked before an Eldode had it cleared, before whatever purpose the cabin was originally built for, before Nora had made it into what it became. Harrow Creek itself, the stream below the ridge, still ran. X are patient things. They do not forget their banks because the human arrangements above them change. But the name Harrow Creek appeared on fewer and fewer local maps through the early 20th century and eventually was replaced by a generic designation on the County Topographic Survey of 1921, the name by which the stream had been known for 60 years before that, the name that allowed Puett to write Harrow Creek in his notebook and have anyone in the county know immediately where he meant was gone. And yet, in 1912, a historian from Vanderbilt University named Herschel Grant came to Overton County to research a chapter of a book he was writing about Reconstruction-era Tennessee. He was a thorough man in the mold of Puett before him, with a talent for finding documents that had been filed in unexpected places. In the County Historical Society's collection, he found the letters that Puett had donated before his death, the Methodist Circuit Writer's account, the partial list with Nora's registration, the fragments of correspondence. He found Puett's private notebooks, which Puett had left to the Historical Society in his will, with a note indicating they were of possible interest to someone with more distance from the events than I had. Grant spent 3 days with the notebooks. He wrote a brief chapter about the cabin, 4 pages in a book that was otherwise focused on the formal mechanisms of Reconstruction governance, in which he described the Harrow Creek settlement as an example of what he termed the informal infrastructure of freedom, by which he meant the networks of mutual support, concealment, and resource sharing that had existed outside and beneath the official Reconstruction apparatus, and that in his assessment had often been more effective at protecting freed people than the official apparatus itself. He gave no sensational account of the windowless cabin. He mentioned it in one sentence that the structure had been built without window openings, a feature that he interpreted as deliberate concealment rather than poverty or architectural limitation, and that this deliberateness seemed characteristic of the settlement's entire approach to its own existence. His book was published in 1914. It sold a modest number of copies, was reviewed in 2 academic journals, and was largely forgotten by 1925, but it was not entirely forgotten. In 1931, a woman named Addie Tate, who was 71 years old and lived in Nashville, wrote a letter to the Vanderbilt History Department asking if anyone had continued Grant's research into the Harrow Creek settlement. She explained that she had grown up in a household in Cincinnati where a certain story was told, not officially, not often, but told about a woman in the Tennessee Hill Country who had kept a cabin without windows where children were taught to read. She explained that her mother, who had died in 1919, had spoken of this story as something she had been told by someone who had been there, not as a legend, but as a fact, related by a person with direct knowledge. Addie Tate's letter was answered by a graduate student who told her politely that Grant's work was the extent of the documented research and that the subject was not currently being pursued by anyone in the department. She wrote back, including in her letter a detail that the graduate student apparently found interesting enough to pass to the head of the department because the subsequent correspondence escalated. The detail was this: that her mother had told her as a specific fact, passed down from the original source, that Nora had kept the book Hale described, the catalog of learning, the record of what each child knew when they arrived, and knew when they left, and that this book had not been lost, that it had been passed when Nora left the cabin for the last time to the oldest child then in residence with instruction, that it was to be carried and given to whoever would understand what it meant. The department wrote back asking whether Addie Tate had any further information about where this book might be. She did not answer the letter. She died in 1938. Her estate was modest. Her papers were not preserved. Whether the book still exists, whether it was passed from person to person as Nora apparently intended, whether it sits in someone's home right now without its owners fully understanding what they have, is a question that cannot be answered. But it is the right question what the cabin was, Finally, there is no tidy conclusion to the story of the cabin above Harrow Creek. This is not because the story was incomplete, but because the people who lived it were not interested in providing conclusions. They were interested in surviving, in teaching, in passing along to the next person, whatever the current person had managed to accumulate of knowledge and capacity. Conclusions were for people who had the leisure of looking backward. Nora and the children of the cabin were for as long as the cabin operated entirely occupied with looking forward. What can be said is this. Sometime between Cartwright's October 1875 visit and the 1882 surveyor's note about one structure in partial disrepair, uninhabited, the cabin ceased to be occupied. Whether Nora left voluntarily, whether she died there, whether she moved to another location and continued some version of what she had been doing, none of this is recorded. She entered the historical record as a name without a family name, and she left it the same way. The children, the 20 to 30 by estimate, who passed through over a dozen years, carried what they had been then into the world. Some of them may have told the story. Most of them probably did not. They had been raised by a woman who understood with bone-deep precision the uses of silence. They had learned their reading from books that were not in any library. They had grown up in a room without windows, in a house without a deed, on land that officially belonged to no one, and they had emerged from it knowing things that the world around them would have preferred they not know. That is in the end what the cabin was for, not for hiding, for building something that could not be taken. Elias Puit, who spent 23 years trying to put the cabin into the official record where it belonged, understood this only at the very end. His last notebook entry trails off mid-sentence, as though he ran out of words, or decided that words were, for once, not the right tool. The creek still runs below the ridge. The trees have had 150 years to reclaim the hillside. Whatever foundation stones the cabin rested on, if there were any, if the structure was built on anything more permanent than packed earth and intention, are under the roots now. The land does not give them back, but something else happened in those hills during the years the cabin stood and was used. Something invisible and unmapped and illegible to the official record, which was of course precisely the point. If you are someone whose great-grandmother learned to read from a woman who had no last name in a room with no windows in the Tennessee hills somewhere around 1869, then you know the rest of the story. And if you are not, then you have only this: a man's private notebook, a circuit writer's letter, a bureau agent's book of stitched bark and cord, and a hillside that has been growing back over its own evidence for 150 years. It is not nothing. It is in fact everything that was meant to survive.